The Street by George Tutuska. Tutuska is an artist and musician working out of Buffalo, New York. Some of you might even be familiar with some of his music, but he's since been concentrating on painting. This work is acrylic on canvas painted in the winter of 2020, and it looks like an example of an exercise with a palette knife. Now, a few months back, before the ongoing COVID pandemic at the present time wreaked havoc on plans that were in place and in motion, artist Solveig Inga, aka the artsy Marxist, was in the midst of creating a website for the Revolutionary Art Collective that they spearhead. They had been asking for photo submissions of art from artists for the digital gallery on the website. I was helping with that process, and that was when I first saw this image and this work. And if I'm speaking frankly, it pretty much took my breath away. I'm only speaking for myself here, but this painting spoke to me almost immediately because I felt like I knew where this work was coming from and where it was going. And of course, I'm speaking in a most subjective manner. And so ultimately, this painting is a mystery. That's another reason why I felt drawn to it, because it is a mystery. And yet it's also one that I feel I have the answer to, subjectively speaking. It's such a simple scene in form, and yet there's so much is going on in it. It's an anti-Thomas Kinkade in that respect. When I look at this work, so many different things jump out at me. For one, just the texture of the painting itself. I love a tactile painting where you can see where the artist got in there with a brush or a knife. I like that. And I get that with this. That's just a personal preference. Ultimately, the magic and the mystery of this painting lies in what's depicted and how it is depicted. I don't know if this work is based on a real street that the artist Tutuska knows. But in the grand scheme, it is irrelevant whether it is based on a real street. It is an allegorical street, whether it's based on a factual place or not. And this is what matters. Primarily, there are three symbolic archetypes constellated in this painting. Two of them are depicted singularly, perhaps one reflecting the other, while the third is depicted in plurality, but also in reflection. The name of the painting is The Street, so we see this street. Not a street, the street. More on the street a little later. Two above it, in the higher reaches of the painting, based on the perspective, is a sky. And thirdly, we have a number of houses abutted against each other on both sides of the street, as well as being abutted against the street itself, really. There is a narrow sidewalk on each side, separating the architecture from the street somewhat. But visually, the architecture just looms over the road here. And each of these houses has all of their street side windows illuminated, warm light inside in contrast with the cold darkness of the street in the foreground and on into the distance. So I want to look at these three elements and discuss them case by case, and I hope to tie them together in a coherent, meaningful fashion, albeit a subjective fashion. But I also want to be careful and not try to profane the magic of this image too much with a complete deconstruction, because this seems to be a work that is coming from the depths of an individual life experience, and to sit here and methodically deconstruct it as an observer would be folly. I want to begin with the houses. And in spite of the lights inside, they each have a haunting quality. There is also an intangible spiritual quality present as well. To me, that's indicated by how each of these houses have an attic light or a single top floor window on to them. The upper floor windows almost come across as stained glass as well. I don't know if that's on purpose or just the effect the painting emits. So the buildings are reminiscent of churches or chapels in that respect. And the way these buildings just loom over the road kind of gives an ominous, almost haunting feeling. They almost come across as dark-robed entities aligned, standing in judgment. And there are fascinating psychological methods and disciplines where one can discern things about the psychological makeup of the artist in how they draw or paint something like architecture. Houses in particular, every detail has immense psychological meaning potentially, even in how the artist might sign their name to the work. Now, I'm not going to do a psychological profile on the artist here, but there is something very interesting about each of these houses depicted, and it's almost silly not to mention this. And that I noticed it might say something about me as a viewer. And what I see are houses or buildings to which none have doors. There's no entry and there's no exit. Now, if we want to apply ration and reason to the work, we could say, well, the entrances are on the other side, and we are essentially looking at a back alley here. And that wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but it doesn't matter. What matters is in the image, what was chosen or not chosen to be depicted. In this case, doors. They are absent. And so the lack of doors offers two obvious meanings to me, both of which sort of work in concert with each other. On one side of the coin, there is a feeling of being kept as an outsider. The individual on this street is fated to forever be an outsider so long as he or she walks it. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, there is also a notion of feeling constrained or trapped in a situation that one can't escape. Doorways, entrances, exits, they are key components to any architecture, and in this work there are none to be seen. But there are windows, and all of the windows are lit up. And another thing about them, someone else that I had take a look at the painting actually even pointed this out to me before I really noticed it, but there almost seems to be a hint of watchers in the windows. Ghost-like figures. I'm not sure if this is on purpose or an accident, magic of the paint when it hits the canvas, or if I'm seeing something that's not there, but there do seem to be entities in the houses at some of the windows. I mean, we know there are people in these houses or buildings. There are lights on. Whether or not they are there at the windows is up to interpretation, but there is intelligence residing in these houses. And so these buildings themselves almost come across like leering faces. And this goes back to the looming figures standing in judgment. Only if they're not these wraith-like, archonic, black-robed entities standing in impartial judgment, and I want to say impartial because not all judgments are bad. Sometimes one can be the benefactor of a favorable judgment. I don't really feel a sense of malice. The feeling is more so one of a Gnostic sense of unattached impartiality or indifference. And so thematically, it reminds me of a recent image by Canadian artist Serena Malion. Malion calls this work Night Patrol, and we see some buildings or houses below, and there are large robed entities holding lanterns, among other things. The entities in Malion's image are literally holding swords, which can be symbols of judgment because poetically swords denote the tongue, and judgments are typically the type of thing that is uttered. Two different themes and visual narratives occurring in each work, but the form of the narratives are quite reminiscent of each other. And there is something else I'm going to get into here in just a moment, but going back to Malion's work, take note of something in the sky here. Notice how the stars appear multicolored. But so circling back now to Tuska's work, everything I've noted thus far in regard to the looming indifferent architecture of the street can also give rise to an important human universal, the feeling of alienation. And I consider myself someone who comes from a Gnostic matrix, and so the universal idea of alienation is one I'm well versed in from that Gnostic point of view. I will come back to this, but let's move on. Of all the mysteries involved in this work, the mystery of its sky looms large. It's silver. It almost looks like a patchwork, and there are little colorful orbs in the sky. Are they abstract stars? Perhaps. The colors do seem to correspond to the lights in the windows, but does that mean they are stars? Maybe someone released a number of Chinese lanterns in the sky beyond the horizon line. Maybe they're streetlights at a festival like San Gennaro in New York or Mardi Gras. Maybe they're airplane taillights as they crisscross the night sky. I don't know. And really, I don't want to know. I like the mystery in this sense. The silver aspect of the sky coupled with the dark black and blue of the street below give the painting an almost rainy feel, in which case, if it is a scene in the rain, you don't typically see stars under such conditions. And as I said before, if you look to the left and right of the street, there does appear to be those sidewalks for pedestrians. So it's a paved street for driving with maybe a sheen of moisture over the sidewalks and the street itself. And the point of perspective almost seems to match that of a driver. So perhaps it is raining, and therefore those colors in the sky, which correspond to the colors of the lights in the windows, could perhaps be droplets of water on a windshield capturing the light, which could also explain the dreamlike distortion or aesthetic of the painting. When you look out a windshield, the surroundings are distorted by the water in the windshield. And the sky in this painting almost has a cascading effect to it, like it's water coming down, as it might cascade down a windshield. So this is something to perhaps keep in mind as a possible interpretation. But speaking for myself, I don't see this as a rainy scene. As far as how I choose to see this work by George Tatuska, I see it as a dark night, but a clear night. Now, perhaps it rained a little earlier and there is that sheen of moisture, but the rain is gone. And so for me, those are stars. This image exists in the vesica between concrete reality, as represented by the street and the buildings, and an abstract dream, as really seen in the abstract sky. And in an abstract sky, the vastness of space doesn't have to be black. It can be silver. And the stars can be just as colorful as a rainbow. And if you've ever been outside under a starry sky in something like an altered state of consciousness, the stars can sometimes take on other colors or even shapes that one wouldn't be accustomed to when in this state of waking ego consciousness. One thing I cannot say though, I've never seen a silver sky at night, not a clear silver sky. The abstract silver sky here adds to the element of a universal mystery, a necessary key ingredient for a visual poem or song, which is what this painting is. And so, as I said, I don't want to know what's going on with the sky. I hope it's never explained, because if it is, then I'll want to process that information, because that's just how I am. But I prefer this as it is. I prefer the dreamlike mystery of that sky. And here we come to the final element of this work, and the one that ties everything together: the street. In terms of form and color, the street could almost be seen as the most uninteresting part of the painting. The buildings have a lot going on by comparison. The sky is full of mysteries. The street, on the other hand, on the surface, it's dark and straight, And visually, that's about it. But it is the street where the work's depth really comes from, and where the wisdom in the poetry of its symbol really lies. We have the buildings looming over the street to the left and to the right, casting it in shadow. Aside from one building with 6 windows, which is a contradiction to the point I'm about to make, but the other buildings all only have 5. But the architecture is really, it's reflecting itself. There is a mirroring effect happening here visually, left to right and right to left. Thematically, the sky and the street mirror each other, because though it might not look as interesting, thematically, there is just as much mystery happening with the street as there is in the sky. And there is just as much wonder happening with the street as there is with the sky. Where does this street lead to? Where is it coming from? We don't know what or who is lurking in its shadows any more than what we know about what's on the dark side of the moon. And is that a red stoplight at the end of the street in this scene? What does it mean if it is? Does it indicate death? Or is it just another light in another window? I have no concrete objective answers. These are questions that might not have answers. Such questions exist. It drives people crazy, but they do. But here is what I can say. All of us, every human being, we are all magicians and we are all artists. Just not all of us know that. But if you dabble in either of those two crafts and you're doing so conscientiously, it won't take too long before the reality dawns on you that the magician and the artist are one and the same. And though everyone's craft and medium may be different, magicians and artists, we all still are. And as I see it, this is the road the magician artist must all walk. This is the street of the authentic self. This is the pathway. And though it isn't always scary, it is certainly dark. And sometimes it can be scary because it's the path of the authentic self. No one has walked it before. It's dark from an archetype point of view, metaphorically speaking. From the metaphorical point of view, it is a dark road. At best, we have guideposts, little lights that keep us on whatever path we're on. But there are always dark patches of shadow where no light reaches, because when you live the authentic life, there's really nothing to go by. What's in those shadows? Treasures or annihilation? The magician's work, the artist's work, the individual working or living the authentic existence, it involves exploration of the shadows, of the mysteries. And those of us who are conscious of this reality can very easily see this sometimes as almost like a cross to bear, considering that the true magician or the true artist is also constantly living within the judgments of the culture construct, the society that the magician artist exists in, as represented in this work by the buildings or the houses. And this is not entirely bad. Just as I said, not all judgments are necessarily bad. The cultural construct by default, even if at times we wish it would not, it does keep the magician artist on a path. Sometimes it's against their will, but sometimes it's for their own good too. It all depends on the moment and in the context. So the street depicted here is completely allegorical. It is every dark street illuminated by small window lights or street lamps or any other light-giving device I've ever gone down in metaphorical explorations. And there are faces who peek out watching what you're doing. Either they're curious or they're concerned, or they want to see you succeed or they want to see you fail. The potentiality for all of that, it exists. Especially for the people who are living or attempting to live the authentic existence. There are people in your life, and you know who they are, who want to see you fail. If you're doing your own thing and you're living the authentic life, that rubs people the wrong way. And I know who they are in my life. Sometimes they're not even conscious of it, but in spite of their inability to process their own true feelings, you intuit their feelings that are directed at you for whatever they are. And there are some people who kind of get a little morbid pleasure out of watching you fail. But there are also people in your life who want to see you succeed. Ideally, the two balance out. So the term judgment often has negative connotations for good reason, but it can work both ways. So bear that in mind. But harbored in this mirroring effect in this painting is a self-awareness on the artist's part. That's the function of a mirror, self-awareness in real time. And so when we have so much mirroring and reflection going on in a work, it almost, to me, seems to indicate an intangible sense of, or perhaps just a hint of sentience by the artist on this matter. That they are living or doing their best to live an authentic existence in spite of all of the drawbacks. I mean, perhaps self-awareness and sentience are not the best words to use in this context, but there are embers of gnosis glowing in the fire pit here. Whether an actual flame accompanies the embers, I couldn't say, but the glowing embers are all that matter. They're there. It means that there is potential for the flame to exist. And like I just mentioned, the cross to bear, and you see the reflection of the sky to the street from 12 to 6 and back from 6 to 12, and the buildings from 3 to 9 and back from 9 to 3. There is a hint of a cross in this respect, an equilateral Gnostic cross here. But even more to the point, insofar as the actual form and shape of the image, you can even see a literal cross. The Gnostic cross is hinted at, but in shape and form, a Coptic cross, or in more recent times, a Maltese cross, is literally depicted. I'm not saying this was on purpose. It's actually more interesting and more exciting to me if it just kind of happened by accident. Nor am I saying that the painter intends this to be a religious work, not by any stretch. But subjectively speaking, there is a deeper psycho-spiritual narrative unfolding here. And any allusions to orthodoxy are just part of the magic of the process. And again, this might just be me, or maybe it's part of the spell the painting casts. But in that first window on the right, I almost see an icon of the Virgin Mary. And that is almost certainly unintentional, but I can't unsee it. The magician-artist's road is deeply personal, and yet it is subject to gawkers and onlookers, which is fine. That's why art is created. It wants to be seen. But with that comes inevitable judgment, and that's inescapable, which ties back to the idea that there are no doors, or that once you're on this street, there's no leaving the street. Just look at it. You have to keep going. And it is an alienating process, and if you experience it enough, one only becomes further and further alienated. Will the rendered judgments be in the magician-artist's favor or against it? We don't know. And for a magician-artist to explore his or her imagination and to process what they find and then commit it to whatever medium they are working through and then put it out there for others to consume, that is a spiritual battle. And it is a dark battle. It is dark because you don't know what you'll find and what reactions it will elicit. But it's also a great battle, a wonderful battle, a battle you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not fighting it, or you're not going down those dark streets that lay before you as the magician artist. We won't know until the work, the labor, the drive is complete. This is the dark street we go down. This is the dark street in this painting. And for me, what is at the end of this street? Gnosis.